So when we talk about Indigenous Canada and we look at the results of that referendum and we realize that all we've had in this class already a lot of conversations about tensions between the federal government in Ottawa and the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs and all of those sorts of things and the Indigenous population of Canada, right? And then you look at the voting results and you're like, wait a minute, the Indigenous population voted to stay within Canada? That's really confusing, sort of. And in order to make sense of that, we need to talk a little bit about economics. So we can have long debates about whether Quebec, as an independent nation, is economically viable at all, in terms of whether Quebec can afford to sort of function as a country without even the things like the guarantee of the ability to sell goods in Ontario and in the Maritimes, all of those sorts of things, right? Like this is not um, a particular, like, that is a debatable question and we're not really going to get into it, just so you're aware that that is part of the conversation. And it's one of the planks of a campaign platform to convince people to vote no, is that like, yeah, if you do that, you're going to make your country really, really poor and it's going to suck. You're going to drop quality of life. And we can have debates about whether or not that is true. However, there is no real debate as to whether or not Quebec is economically viable without the resources in northern Quebec. So I'm not expecting you to have an in-depth sense of like what kinds of money are made in Quebec. What you need to understand though is that the northern part of Quebec is responsible for the vast majority of their mining income, is responsible for the vast majority of the forestry income, is responsible for the vast majority of the hydroelectric sort of energy generation. And those three industries provide an enormous amount of money and are a really, really big proportion of Quebec's economy overall. And I mean that both in terms of resource and royalty revenues and in terms of the jobs that they provide and the taxes of the people who work in those jobs, all of those sorts of things. So we can talk about whether Quebec as a whole is economically viable, but Quebec without Northern Quebec is 100% not economically viable. It cannot stand alone. Okay? That's important because the vast majority of Northern Quebec, in fact, all of it, is traditional Indigenous territory. And that is part of what explains the decision, the sort of tendency for Indigenous populations, Indigenous people in Quebec, to vote to remain within Canada. And we've had a couple of students sort of comment about the similarity in terms of the treatment of Indigenous people by the federal government and the Francophone population of Quebec, of Canada, and the federal government. And there's been a number of students who've been talking about the similarities between the two, about how there are similar attempts at assimilation, there are similar attempts at sort of limiting that, there's similar conversations about sort of even economic outputs and economic outcomes, all of those sort of similarities. And I'm here to tell you that at the very least, the separatists within Quebec do not see it that way. And what I mean by that is that in 1995, the separatists, their assumption, and they didn't check with anyone or talk about it, but their interpretation of the law was that if the province of Quebec separated from Canada, they would separate with their borders intact, i.e. the shape of the province would remain exactly the same, and that the sovereignty or the treaty administration would simply move from the government in Ottawa to the government of Quebec. And what that basically means is that there's an assumption that the Indigenous population of Quebec can be treated like property to be transferred by contract. And the separatists sort of assumed that that was going to be the case, so they're like, yeah, well, we'll just set up our own Department of Indian Affairs and administer the same treaties and, manage the same reserves. And it's important to understand that in this context, right, this is 1995, the last residential school in Canada is still open, and we're just sort of dealing with the emergence of, first of all, some treaty negotiations, some more contemporary ones that we'll talk about in our next unit, but also some changes around sort of how people identify and the sort of extent of the challenges faced by Indigenous Canadians are sort of becoming more apparent. And so Indigenous leaders in Quebec turned around and said, no, we signed treaty with Canada to use our land, and if you would like to use our land as part of this new country of Quebec, you can renegotiate because it's still ours. And there was a strong reluctance to do that on the part of separatists, partially, and we'll sort of get into some of the details of this, because by 1995 there was no way that any Indigenous group in Canada was going to sign a treaty that allowed for $4 a year in stipends to pay for the land that is sort of relevant here. So the conversation would have been like, if you sort of renegotiated all of those, if the government of Quebec had renegotiated all of those treaties, that would have been much more expensive. And so basically the separatists sort of said, yeah, no, that's not happening. And at that point, the conversation sort of becomes Indigenous leaders within Quebec saying, yeah, okay, I guess, but if you vote to separate from Canada, that means we get to have another vote to leave your country and rejoin Canada. And so there's some tensions about that. And one of the things that that means is that you have, again, this sort of tension around who votes which way. Part of this is about sort of separatists in Quebec were playing into that narrative of Canada being a partnership of two nations, right? If you think about Canada as being only Anglophone and Francophone, then it's really easy to erase those Indigenous voices. But I will also say that there are very few Indigenous people who see Canada as only Anglophone and Francophone. There's a lot more kind of stuff going on with that. So, that is an introduction to sort of what Indigenous voices in this process looks like.